Welcome. I'd like to call this meeting to order and welcome the gentleman to my left who has a long title tonight, Acting Director and Acting Secretary of the Board. Mr. Cooney, welcome.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you please rise for the singing of our national anthem? I would like to go to 501, and it's moved by Mr. Trustee Barry, seconded by Trustee McCrae, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve consent agenda items 5.02 to 5.04, June the 5th, 2019. Sorry, I'll finish this one first.
Okay, sir.
And I just wanted to point out the consent agenda consists of approval of the minutes and approval of the agenda. It's sort of a pro forma, so that's why we do it in block. So could you cast your vote, please? Yes.
I think you need to roll call first because you don't know whether you have a quorum or not until you do roll call.
Good point. Acting Director, would you take...
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've been practicing.
Okay, I know you can do it.
This is the roll call for our meeting of June 5th, 2019. Trustee Barry.
Present.
Trustee Cram.
Present.
Trustee Danaher.
Present.
Trustee Jacobs.
He's trying to call in.
Vice Chair McPherson.
Present.
Chair McAllister.
Present.
Trustee McCrae. Here. Trustee McDonald.
Present.
Trustee Parisian.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Schooler.
Present.
Trustee Swan.
Present.
Student Trustee Busher-Cadra.
Present.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You have quorum.
Thank you. So going back to the motion that was initiated by Trustee Barry and seconded by Trustee McCrae that the Upper Canada District School Board approve consent agenda items 5.02 to 5.04, June 5th, 2019 as submitted. Please cast your vote online. The motion is carried. 601, are there any conflict of interest declarations? Seeing none, we'll move to item 7.0, which is private session. And I just wanted to point out, if I could, for the benefit of anybody who is watching or listening, or as well as ourselves, the Education Act, Section 207-2, determines that the closing of certain committee meetings, a meeting of the committee of the board, including a committee of the whole board, may be closed to the public when the subject matter under consideration involves the disclosure of intimate personal or financial information in respect of a member of the board or committee, an employee or prospective employee of the board, or a pupil of his or her parent or guardian, and decisions in respect to negotiations with employees of the board. So that is the case this evening for this private session, and we will be in and out as quickly as we can. So I turn the chair over to you.
Thank you.
Did I miss something?
Any non-staff?
Right.
So let's give him a time. We need to get a motion.
You need a motion to go into private section. Okay,
Well, I
thanks.
guess you don't have to. Yeah, you do, because it's a vote.
Okay, thanks.
Well, folks, we're now back into public session, and I need a motion that the Committee of the Whole move into, that the Upper Canada District School Board move back into the regular board meeting, June 5th, 2019, at 7:27. Moved by Trustee Barry, Trustee McCray. Cast your ballot, please. Motion's carried. I'm moving to item 901 on the agenda, which is comments from the Acting Director of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Very briefly, today we had our final LLMA, which is the Leading and Learning Modules for Administrators. It was the last time for this year that we have the entire leadership cadre of the board together, and we managed to cover a wide range of topics. Talked a lot about our accomplishments and our work from this past year and for the coming year. Certainly things around Indigenous education, equity, student success program, special education, and wellness. And it was a very successful day. I'd also like to point out that this past Saturday was the first ever Pride Parade in Kemptville. It was very successful, and we had a good representation from Upper Canada schools, including Kemptville Public School, North Grenville, South Branch, and a very enthusiastic and large contingent from Nation View Public School. And again, very successful, and we look forward to for next year's. And that's everything. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Item 1001, Chair of the Board comments. The only comment I have two. I want to comment briefly on the celebration evening, which was held this past Monday at North Grenville District High School, when the Upper Canada Board awarded its volunteer awards, service awards, and the Director's Award of Merit. Truly, it was a great evening with I like to call it there was a family feel to it. And so congratulations to all the recipients and the nominees, and to everyone who attended. I also draw your attention, trustees, to information item 1401, and student achievement and wellness. The SIPSA digital presentations by the Upper Canada schools. There are two there. The first is from Jennifer Moore, Principal Jennifer Moore from Front of Young Public School, and the second one is from Principal Jeff Campbell from Rockland District High School. This is a new format that we are looking at. And I hope that if you have viewed your presentations, you will find them informative. So I want to thank Principals Moore and Campbell for breaking new ground. And who knows, they may have new careers in broadcasting. So that concludes my remarks, Chair. And now I'm going to item 1101. You don't.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The report is attached. It is a summary of the Board of Directors meeting for OPSPA for May 3rd and May 4th. I do want to highlight one particular area. That was the presentation that was provided to student trustees, President and Vice President of the Ontario Student Trustee Association, OSTA-ACO. Ryan Brown and Sean McCloskey were there, and this was the second time that OSTA-ACO presented to OPSPA in the last year. OPSPA has also undertaken an ad hoc committee to try and be more engaged and more of a resource, or more of a conduit to work with OSTA-ACO, so that we do have them at our meetings for information sharing and also for feedback. Ryan and Sean were making their final presentation as members of OSTA-ACO. Well, maybe not their final. They probably did that at their annual meeting, but made it to OPSPA. They were well received. Two individuals who, not unlike our own student trustee, speak very highly of the education system, are very informed and immersed with the issues of education and really are great individuals to promote public education in Ontario, and certainly put the pressure on government, whether it's the current government or previous government, to know how it impacts them individually. And I think from our perspective at OPSPA, it's always good to make sure that we have those connections in place and use those resources effectively. And I will say we use them effectively in the sense that we did have a day where we, OPSPA, had wasn't a lobbying day, but it was a day where we, an advocacy day where we actually went to Queen's Park and met with education minister and critics of education. We invited our executive and also I think it was Sean that was there. I think they both might have been there. In any event, we had student trustees. They were probably the ones who garnered the most attention from the politicians, because we also had a reception where all MPPs were invited. And they really made sure that individuals, MPPs, were aware of the issues that are facing kids in our schools today, and the impacts that it will have on their future. So very glad that they were able to share their success over the last year and what's happening with OSTEACO moving forward. But certainly glad that they were able to participate in our advocacy day and catch the ear of our members of provincial parliament. The other information is there for your perusal, trustees, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. We'll note that we do have our AGM in collaboration with the Canadian School Board Association, July 3rd to the 7th. There'll also be a national trustee gathering on Indigenous education at that same time. So it's a 3-for-1 conference. We will have National Chief Perry Bellegarde and lots of other speakers that will be there to be able to speak about the impacts on us in education today, and some strategies on how we can certainly move forward and help the students in our schools. That's my report, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Trustee McDonald. Item 1201. You have a question?
Yeah.
Yes.
What, David, what the students say? What jumped out at you that you heard more than once? Or what are they saying?
Well, I mean, the students are very articulate with the current measures that are in place. So how class size will impact certain things, how some of the issues will impact certainly rural schools. It's no different than what we've talked about at this table and we've talked about at OPSPA, but it is a different voice. It's the voice of the individuals that are being impacted, that are sharing that. They also are, they're not there to be an enemy of any current government or any future government, but really their interest is making sure that they have ability to communicate with the government and provide them their feedback on a regular basis. So from OPSPA's standpoint, that's what we want to ensure, that we engage with them on a more frequent basis, but also that we support them at our individual boards, just as we do with our own student trustee, to make sure that they're members of the OSTEACO and active members of OSTEACO, because they also did go over the chaperone piece and making sure that some trustees were comfortable that when we send a student trustee that we're not sending them off to a big city on their own and they're left to their own devices. There are individuals there that do chaperone and it isn't, there is a lot of structure to it and there's a lot of professionalism to it, and they really did, they've talked about that in the past, but their main emphasis is around how certain policy decisions are going to impact students moving forward.
I wonder if Trustee Cadro has any. I'd like to hear. I'm very curious what your thoughts on students' perspective of what's going on. Anything?
Sorry, like,
Well, I just what the report that David has brought forward, and you would have been in hearing what the student trustees have said. I know you're on the executive, and is there anything that's, I'm just curious, anything that really is important that you'd like to?
Trustee Busher, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, well, through you, Chair, I think Trustee McDonald covered most of it. I think the biggest focus this year has been working with the government and not working against the government. meeting with Minister of Education and trying to work with her to see what we can do about certain policies and certain things that have been discussed at Queen's Park. That's been the biggest focus of the year. And as well, the Catholic Board Council and Public Board Council presidents and vice presidents attending OPSPA and OXTA meetings. And I think Trustee McDonald mentioned conferences, which is my realm of OSTA.
All right.
Thank you, Trustee Bushra. Are there any further questions to Trustee McDonald? Seeing none, I'm going to move to item 1201. And Trustee McDonald, you are again on tap for the Upper Canada District School Board Culture Survey and the results from the 2018 survey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The attachment to your agenda is the PowerPoint that's before you. So Accountability Framework is a standing committee of the board. It carries out the work that was laid out in the next level driven document that was really started in 2013. That report focused on the overview of the board's critical success factors and obviously the key results indicators that are associated to that. We use those drivers, those individual pieces, to help define our board work plan and our strategic. The board work plan obviously is the more localized work, the more current work of our strategic plan. More particularly, this report, we're going to focus on the key result indicators, the staff and student culture survey. Just for your review, the critical success factors that we all know, collaboration, resources, educational programs, and wellness. And as I said, we're going to focus on, here's our key results indicators and our results indicators that we've listed within the document. We're going to focus on two of these today, and that's the student culture survey and the staff culture survey. So the culture survey was undertaken in the fall of 2018. It was conducted by Ipsos. It's a follow-up from a first wave of a survey that was that actually begun in 2014 and finished in 2015. This survey seeks feedback from our staff and our secondary students, and that is the grade 7 to 12 students, on the critical success factors of the board, and certainly helps us, the board, develop its work plan and strategic plan. It was an online survey. It was conducted between the 14th and 28th for our staff, and the 17th and 28th for our students. This year we had 1,746 responses from staff, and 5,866 responses from students. The change this particular wave is that we did not include the elementary students and their parents. Previously, we had an opportunity for parents of elementary students to participate in a two-part type survey where they would answer some of the survey questions and then allow the elementary student to participate. And their answers were based on, rather than agree or disagree, would be a smiley face or a sad face. We didn't include that this time. So the format that you see before you is a little different than what we would have reported on in the results from 2014 and 15. It was our first time conducting the survey. So this particular survey, you'll see, it seems busy, but there's a lot of information there that's helpful and resourceful. The areas that are kind of in the middle of the screen that talk about the areas of improvement and areas of focus compare 2014 to 2018. So it shows that we've made some progress in some areas, or in some areas where we need to dive a little deeper and get some work done. So with respect to collaboration, at the outset I talked about collaboration, and it's to facilitate parent involvement, student achievement, and public confidence. We must engage local and learning communities. So the underlying piece here is that 46% of our staff agree there is good communication within the UCDSB. So that's a change from the previous survey of 45%. Not a huge change, but a significant change, I guess, in the sense that we are seeing progress. So when we dig down a little bit deeper, we look at the sections on the left. Now it says what we learned. And these are these are excerpts from the actual survey. So communication from UCDSB, and sorry, we've actually got a typo there. I just see that. It's UC, not US. Improved, but lower perceived confidence in the school board from the community. So we see that that's an issue at the accountability framework, and we think we need to pay some attention to that as a board. We want to ensure that our communities have confidence in the board. The good news is the communities do have confidence in their schools. I won't go into detail on the specifics on the far right. I want to focus on what we learned, what our next steps are, and then we'll certainly move into what our recommendations will be. Our next steps from accountability framework we discussed. The board recognizes that the communication with the community is important and integral to the success of students in schools. The UCDSB sees an opportunity to collaborate with parents and the community about how to better engage others in preparing all students for a successful life. So some of the work that we'll be doing is making sure that we have that engagement in that collaborative approach with our communities. We want to certainly change the trajectory on what our communities, how our communities perceive the school board. That's from a staff perspective. If you scroll down a little bit further, what we learned on the student side of things on collaboration is that while one in three students say there are better places to go to school, this is down significantly from 2014. So 33% agree now versus 38%. However, satisfaction with the education they receive has decreased. 64% of our students are satisfied with their education at UCDSB. So obviously we have some work to do. If our mission is to prepare all students for successful life, we need to make sure that they're satisfied with their education, engaged with their education. So our next steps will focus on student engagement as a vital role in enhancing student belonging and contributors to academic achievement. The board is undertaking a review of program delivery at the secondary school level that will increase choices for student learning. So hopefully we'll see some of those significant changes take place and see that number change dramatically. We step into resources. So resources is to create an engaging learning environment, support student achievement, and sustain public confidence. We must carefully manage our resources. Timely that we're going to talk about budget afterwards, but that is where we come into play around resources as well. So in 2018, 40% of our staff feel their school has the staff and support necessary for student success. That's down from 2014. We had 45% previously. What we learned, while staff are more likely to feel resources are allocated effectively and in a timely manner, they are less likely to feel they have enough support. So I wanted to make sure that we draw a distinction that support doesn't mean pens and paper. Support in order to do their position, because there were other significant pieces associated to the survey that talked about material. So this is not material. This is individual support. It could be in the classroom. It could be within the school. Our next step, the board will ensure that the strategic plan determines the work of the district. Through the budget process, we will ensure all allocations support student achievement efficiently and equitably. So I think it's important for us that we pay attention to this piece and ensure that we continue to strive to make sure that our budget allocates resources effectively, efficiently, and equitably, and also to be a little bit more transparent with how that's done as well. From a student perspective, 2018, 68% of students say their school has the equipment and materials necessary for their success and achievement, which is up from 65%. We learned that improvements on equipment for success, interest, classroom size, and empowerment, with no areas flagged for areas of improvement. So when we look at the far right side, the areas that we really focused on our students, we've seen some significant increase and no underlying areas for us to focus on. However, it doesn't mean that we stop there. We continue to do a good job to make sure that we provide those resources for our students. And so in light of that, accountability framework also identified some next steps associated to that. The board is pleased by this improvement and strives to maintain this positive trend. The board will continue to engage our student senate to collect their input on maintaining this outcome and continued progression. So we want to make sure that we have that dialogue and make sure that we continue to ensure that our students are supported within their schools and their classes. We go to educational programs, education, the next slide. Education is to create an engaging learning environment, support student achievement, and sustain public confidence. We must carefully, that's wrong too. I missed that. The education component doesn't deal with resources. 37% of our staff feel that talents and skills are not being put to their full use. So this is down from 2014 at 39%. We know that we've taken some steps and some measures to recognize our staff in light of some of the award ceremonies that we've had recently, an award of merit and director recognition. But yet we still see some staff looking at that a little differently. And so for us, we see that staff are more likely to feel they can advance in their skills, but more likely to feel they have to perform tasks outside of their role and are not provided with opportunities for professional development or to be innovative. So we want to make sure that we address those particular areas so that if we have staff that are working outside of their area of expertise, what supports are we providing them to make sure that they feel confident? What professional development are we able to provide our staff, and how are we going to make sure that that staff feel they have the ability to be innovative? Our next steps, board recognizes that staff value training and professional development. The board will review priorities for staff professional development and explore opportunities for innovation in classroom instruction. From a student perspective, halfway down, 69% of students believe that their staff at their school engage students in the learning process, which is an increase from 65% previously. And for us, we learned that students are more likely to feel they are given opportunity to be innovative outside of school, but trust in staff and confidence that they will graduate have declined. So the significant piece for accountability committee was that the confidence that students have in their ability to graduate. We have an ambitious goal of having a 90% graduation rate. We want all students as our mission to be successful, and we want to prepare them for success. But if the students don't have that confidence to graduate, then we need to do some things to support them. So the board is encouraged that more students feel prepared to make decisions about their future career, but we also continue to examine the areas for focus, which are on the right, by administrating our first ever graduate survey. So one of the things that you saw at the beginning was we talked about some of the key results indicators and focusing right now on the two areas of culture survey for staff and students. But this year we want to actually engage our graduating students. This will be the 2019-2020 school year, and actually move forward and engage them in a survey. And our approach will be that we want to ensure that we conduct the survey prior to their graduation, but try to engage with them as well so that we have some communication with them after graduation to make sure that we are doing what we say we're going to do, preparing all students for a successful life. So that will be some work that the accountability framework will undertake this current year, and we'll have some more reports back to the board on that. And final, we'll look at the wellness area. Wellness. For all staff and students to be able to function at an effective level, we must provide caring and supportive environments. And certainly we see a tremendous emphasis around what happens at this board, and even through the province, the emphasis around wellness and mental health. 2018, 41% of our staff felt valued and recognized by the UCDSB, which is a slight increase over 2014. Improvements to support staff well-being have realized positive results. However, more can be done to support mental and emotional needs of staff and work-life balance. After some discussion at accountability, we really wanted to focus on a couple of areas. The board is encouraged with the areas of improvement noted. However, the board recognizes there is an opportunity to increase the mental and emotional well-being of our employees by ensuring the resources available to them are well known and understood. And that really comes back to employee assistance program to ensure that that employees know what's available so that they can have some place to go when they need to have a conversation, some place to go if they're not sure what they should do next. around their own individual well-being. So significant work will be done around that particular area, and we'll see that in the recommendations. And finally, from a student perspective, in 2018, 46% of secondary students have trouble dealing with stress of school. We saw this last year. Last year it was 49%, sorry, not last year, last time, 2014, it was 49%. And so we've seen a decrease here, but it's still significant. We want to ensure that, just as it did around some of the other pieces around students, we want to make sure that we put some things and some resources and some assistance in place for students, and move any barriers that might be in place for those students. The board recognizes that as an important area, preparing all students for a successful life, the board will continue to monitor measures put in place to support students as they manage academic commitments and other obligations. I think you'll see through the recommendations that we'll see future reports on the measures that we can do to make sure that that students are supported, and that the stress of school may always be there, but certainly the number is adjusted so that they're better able to cope, better able to manage, and be successful overall. So the final 2 pages really come back to recommendations that the accountability framework have put in place that will guide the work of the director and his senior team, and report back to the board in the future. All of this reporting will take place in the academic year or school year of 2019-20. Reports will come to us at various times of the year, and the goal is to make sure that we have this information as we prepare for our next iteration of our strategic plan, as we prepare for our next budget, and also as we begin to move forward with some of the work that we can do to support students in a more general way. There are 8 recommendations here, Mr. Chair, and I'm happy to read them as they are right now, or if you'd like to get discussion first, I'd be happy to deal with that as well.
Are there any questions for Trustee McDonald and the members of the committee who are?
Yes, thank you. So the members of the committee are yourself, Chair McAllister, Trustee Cram, Trustee Danaher, and Trustee Barry. And I certainly thank them for their work. Director Sliwa and Superintendent Dawes for supporting the accountability framework, and certainly tough slugging that goes along with looking at this information and coming up with a final product. So I am certainly appreciative of all the work of the staff and the trustees that make up the committee.
Thank you, Trustee McDonald, for your leadership in this area, which has become a critical part of the trustee and director work plans and the board's strategic plan. It certainly has been a unique and ambitious and courageous tool for us to use, and we just hope to improve upon it. Are there any questions? Yes, Trustee McPherson.
Thank you. Under collaboration, areas for focus, and I guess I'm asking for an opinion rather than an answer. Perceived confidence community has in the Upper Canada District School Board. Percentage completely confident. We've gone from 29%, which is not great, to 8%, which is single digits. Is that a reflection of the local schools, or is that a reflection of the corporate board, as I see sitting from my chair up here?
So it is a reflection on the corporate board, because we ask, in the survey, we asked specifically the confidence that they would have in their individual school. The confidence in the individual school is quite high compared to the corporate board. I would say that the survey was conducted in the fall of 2018. We had also just completed year one of some changes to schools and closed some schools the previous year. So I think that has an impact on the confidence of the corporate board at the time. The good news, though, is that the perception is that the confidence in the individual school is high. For us, from accountability framework, and I think as a board, it's important that we start to draw the connections, that the individual schools are supported by the board, and that the board is certainly supporting and driving the success of students in individual schools. So, that's the work that we need to do to be able to close that gap and make sure that communities have the confidence that they do in the local school, and similarly in the corporate board.
Okay, you actually answered my second question, so thank you.
Any further questions? Seeing none, I'm going to read the motion because there are 8 of them, and I think it's important. There are 8 parts to it, so I need a mover and a seconder. Trustee McDonald, Trustee Cram seconded. That the Upper Canada District School Board of Trustees approve the 8 recommendations listed below associated with the 2018 Culture Survey Results Report as presented at the board meeting of June 5th, 2019. And that the Upper Canada District School Board directs our Director of Education, 1, to identify a range of strategies to engage parents and communities that could be implemented within the next calendar year and to provide a progress report to the board by February 2020. 2, to continue the review of program delivery models for secondary students and how a common timetable will assist in more choice for our students. The Director will report to the board during semester 2 of 2020 and each midterm in the following 2 academic years. 3, as part of the board's effort to renew its multi-year strategic plan during the spring of 2020, to inform the school district about the practice of distributing resources within the district. 4, to work in collaboration with focus groups such as the Upper Canada District School Board Student Senate and school councils to understand the student experience as it relates to the availability of material and equipment for student success. 5, to provide a status report prior to the board's annual budget process for 2020-21 about our staff professional development priorities, including how innovative practices can be engaged in as part of classroom instruction. 6, to ensure that our graduation rate priority continues and that our students develop confidence that they will graduate and are aware of the supports to assist them in this goal. The Director report to the board on progress of the graduation rate in the fall of each year. 7, to promote wellness resources available to all staff through our employee assistance program that supports overall well-being and positive mental health. The Director will provide a report to the board on staff utilization of the program no later than February 2020. 8, to provide a report to the board by no later than November 2019 about the outcome of the 4-school pilot program designed to coordinate a common assignment schedule as a means for supporting students to address their academic commitments. Are there any questions on that motion? Yes, Trustee McPherson.
Thank you. Just a point of clarification. Item number 8, when we talk about the 4-school pilot program, that is not the one that is being considered for special education? No, okay.
No relation.
Okay, thank you.
Seeing no questions, I would ask you
Just a clarification, please.
Yes, Trustee Swan?
Then what is the 4-school pilot project?
It was identified 2 meetings ago. It's Gananoque, Carlton Place. No?
Through you, Chair. That's the district-wide timetable
Yes.
pilot. It's for semester 2 of next year, however, though, so we won't be able to report on the outcome of the 4-school pilot in November of 2019, because it doesn't occur until February of 2020. But it includes Seaway District High School, North Dundas, Almont District High School, and Gananoque.
Does that answer your question, Trustee Swan?
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions? Seeing none, I would ask that you cast your vote, please. yet.
Progress, huh?
We'll take our time.
Trustee?
Okay, we're going to have to take this vote manually and orally. Yes, Trustee Boucher?
Through you, Chair. Just a point of clarification. What outcome are we hoping to have reported in November 2019? Because the pilot project doesn't begin until February 2020.
So it would be more around how that's going to be implemented for, not necessarily, we're going to see other reports, but this was just to see the progression associated getting to that point.
Okay.
And that would be just the first iteration of what it would look like for that common timetable.
Okay, thank you.
Trustees, we have the motion on the floor. We're taking the vote now. Could you raise your hand in favor, please? On the phone lines?
In favor.
In favor. Trustee Jacobs in favor.
None opposed. The motion is carried. Thank you very much, Trustee McDonald and trustees, for your work on this. We are now going to item 1202, which is the updated 2019-2020 proposed budget considerations and deliberations, June 5th, 2019. And at this point, I believe, Mr. Richard, I will turn this over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Based on the input from the board at the last meeting last week, staff are coming back with a review, some of the items that we've reviewed in the past, and then conclude with a summary of the considerations that have been brought to you over the last several weeks, as well as a potential scenario to begin the board discussion around completing the budget process. And so you'll see in the first slide, Mr. Chair, just a recap of the 1920 budget gap, estimated to be 11.7 million. And I think it's important that we do bring that back to you, in that you'll know that the technical paper was just recently released, and so that was one more piece of information from the government. Staff have gone through it in detail, and at this point, there's no surprises, and the estimate remains at 11.7 million, including an 8.6 million special education expenses over revenue projected for 2019-20. Therefore, obviously, to achieve a balanced budget in accordance with the ministry regulations, and clearly we are aware that the Ministry of Education is changing the regulations, given that they're looking at boards to balance the budget, and at this point in the regulation, the only avenue for looking at a potential deficit is if the board had a surplus the year before. And to the extent that the board had a surplus, even then it's limited to 1%. And as the trustees are well aware, Mr. Chair, it was a deficit for the prior year, and therefore the ministry would expect a balanced budget from the Upper Canada District School Board. And so in order to meet that requirement, it would require reduction in planned spending of approximately $11.7 million. And so we see the guidelines that the staff have been operating under the board's direction, the balanced budget, continue to provide the trustees with a possible, or a range of possible reductions for consideration to achieve that balanced budget, and then gradual reduction in overspending to improve alignment with special education funding. Just a quick review, Mr. Chair, of each of the considerations presented to the board are categorized under either a low, medium, or high impact. And basically the difference under the low impact, it's viewed that there are operational contingencies for addressing the loss of the resource. When we move to that medium category, there's obviously fewer operational contingencies, but in most cases there are some in place. And then finally, very limited or no viable operational contingencies in place to address the loss of the revenue at level 3. And I think, Mr. Chair, it's worth noting, and I think staff have done that in the past, is should make very clear that when we're looking at the impact levels, whether low, medium, or high, there's no value judgment placed on any particular employee group. It doesn't mean that one's valued more or less depending on what impact level that you're categorized in terms of a reduction. Obviously, it can just be the sheer number of a reduction, which tends to push it towards a level 3, because you then have more limited or no viable operational contingencies to address the loss. So we think it's important to point that out. Mr. Chair, the trustees will have seen this over the last several meetings. However, just a quick review so we move into the possible budget scenario for the board's consideration. Recall that under the level 1 impact proposals, we're looking at a reduction in the early childhood educators allocation to better align the expenditures with the available funding coming forward. And it's the same reasoning behind the grades to 4 to 8 classroom teacher allocation. In both cases, it's a more efficient allocating of the resources available that will allow us to align the expenses with the funding coming forward. Secondary programming, student success teachers, this was simply reducing once again to match the funding with the expenditure reduction. To bring it back in line with the 25-to-1 that's in the collective agreement. Central administration staffing, that is simply one position reduction in 2 office areas, 2 departments, that is. We have the TR Léger reorganization, which would contribute savings of just under $1 million. And then we have reductions from the program department. And finally, school operations allocation that would finish off the level 1 impacts, and that would be approximately a $5 million savings, Mr. Chair. As we move to the level 2 impact areas, we have the reallocation of the role in Northern Education program. I think as staff has pointed out in previous meetings, Mr. Chair, this was a pilot project instituted in the 2017-18 year, as well as 18-19, and that pilot project has come to an end. And obviously, given the situation the board finds itself fiscally, one of the options is to move that money to offset some of the $11.7 million in reduction in grants. The reduction, a reorganization of school office support staff, which would be more in alignment, again, aligning expenses with the actual revenue generated by the formulas for school office support staff. A reduction in system teachers, yielding savings just over $1 million. And then we have reduction in school administrators, a couple options, Mr. Chair, that look at the twinning of some of the schools. Under 2A, it would be 6 groups of 2 schools, and in 2B, it's 4 groups of 2 schools. And obviously, the less twinning, there would be less savings. Reduction in system principal assignments, and further reduction in central administrative staffing, which would be the elimination of 1 superintendent position. Under level 3, we have further reductions from the program department under 3A category. And then, of course, going even further reductions from under 3B to yield even more savings. And then there was an option under 3B, Mr. Chair, for further reduction in school administrators under twinning of the schools, which is simply moving the level 2 that you saw earlier, one of the level 2 reductions, and simply providing even less at school administration and therefore yielding further savings for the board. When we look at special education, we have certain reorganizing and reductions in certain areas or different areas in the special education budget. We have a level 1 impact, which obviously would be minimal reduction, but still yielding approximately $816,000 in savings. A level 2 special education, reduction, which obviously would require more reductions in multiple areas in the budget, yielding just under a $2 million savings. And then level 3 would be looking at some major expenditures in the special education department. It should be noticed, Mr. Chair, in all 3 categories, there is a power pilot program that was approved by the board at a previous meeting, which starts to reorganize and remodel some of the special education resources that would be provided to schools. And it is certainly the hope by doing that that would yield more grants in the future under the SIP allocation. Mr. Chair, that's a quick summary of those scenarios we've looked at in the past, as well as a couple more. And we'll just bring up the link here. And this will provide a summary of the all those considerations neatly categorized into level 1, 2, and 3. And on the right is the possible budget scenario to begin the discussions for the board. We've shown them under the level 1, level 2, and level 3 impact designations. And what we're doing is, from the input that the board received from the board last week, Mr. Chair, you'll recall at the end of the meeting, the board asked for, or rather staff asked for some input from the trustees and direction, and I believe the brief summary given by yourself, Mr. Chair, was that we begin with the level 1 impact area reductions and build upon that using a hybrid of the level 2 and level 3. And so you'll see in the green area, those are the first scenario that staff bring to the board that certainly provides you with a balanced budget. You'll see at the bottom the total of $11.7 million rounded off. And what you'll see is, in the case of all the blue items, they've all been moved over to the green area, meaning they would be considered for reduction. And then the appropriate ones from the level 2 and level 3 impact areas that, to start the discussion, that we've moved over to balance the budget. And certainly, Mr. Chair, it's now up to the trustees to have that discussion and finalize which areas you'd like staff to key in on. Mr. Chair, that concludes the presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Richard. Well, trustees, it's now our turn to examine the budget considerations. I just want to point out that we have 2 more meetings, June the 12th and June the 19th. And as I said, my goal this evening was to get to an almost budget, which we would tweak and then finalize on the 12th or the 19th. So, trustees, the floor is open for discussion. Trustee Schooler.
Through you, Chair, I'm wondering if it's possible for staff to go back and take a look at further reducing the number of system principal assignments to equal the current reduction that is proposed in school administrators twinning of schools, option 1, part 1, $423,000, or perhaps reduction in school administrators twinning of schools, option 2, $280,000, in order to ensure that we have a full-time administrator in all our schools.
So you are suggesting then the twinning of schools, option 2?
I'm suggesting no twinning of schools.
No twinning of schools.
I'm suggesting that all schools would have a full-time administrator, and any principal time that would be reduced at the system principal level.
Okay. Would you like a response from the director or one of the staff, or is that just a thought from you?
It's definitely a thought which I believe is worth considering, knowing the value of the principal in the school. I think that that would probably better serve the system to have a full-time administrator in all our schools.
Can I ask for clarification, Trustee Schooler? When you say a full-time administrator, do you envisage that person to be a principal, or could it be a vice principal?
Yes, could be either of those options.
Okay. And a .5, for example, VP would not fit into your category?
Correct.
Okay. Trustee McPherson?
First off, I have the privilege of chairing the Spec Ed Committee. One of the biggest drivers on this deficit is the 8.7 million that we have been topping up special education. I'd like to think that I am a protector of special education, but I have a slight concern with only taking back 816,000. That means your payback is going to be almost 10 years if you continue at that rate. And when I look at other things that are in level 2 and level 3, and the one I really have the problem with is the elimination of our rural guidance counselors. That is something we did to level the playing field between the big schools and the little schools, where we have country high school with 250 kids in it, and we don't even have, up until we did this, we didn't have a full-time guidance counselor. So I think we have to be careful here in what we choose. And the other thing I'd like to see happen, and I guess it would be part and parcel to this process, is an indication of ongoing restraint as we move into the next fiscal year. That before we do something, we ask ourselves, is it entirely necessary? For instance, how often do we mow the grass in the months of July and August in each one of our schools? Are those guys in there once a week? Or can it be done every 2 to 3 weeks, extending that period? It's not a lot of money, but it's found money. So I'm not going to make a firm statement. It's just that when I look at this list, it's going to have an impact regardless, whether it's low, medium, or high. And it's going to be difficult.
Thank you. Mr. McCray?
It struck me at the celebration in Kempville the other night. I don't know if I was the only trustee that thought it, but it struck me with some irony that some of those folks, those innovators, those excellent people may be getting some bad news for too long, which is in this, I thought we came here to be leaders, to do things that are going to firmly improve education. And while I understand that budget processes are necessary and you have to go through them, you have to balance your books. When I hear discussions about poor communication in surveys and talking about reducing to half a person in a school and all that, it comes back to me that we need to very clearly differentiate between what is spent in school and what is spent in system. You look at how the administration is fine and dandy, but we have heard that the people have confidence in our schools, but less so in us making systems and things to support them. So maybe we need to try a little harder to reduce cuts in schools and differentiate clearly between what ones are directly affecting students and ones that are indirectly affecting students. And while we do have a couple meetings left, we do have to get this done pretty soon. But I need to be confident that these are directly benefiting schools. Thank you.
I'd like you to come back a little bit later, if you wouldn't mind, with some precision.
Try me now. What?
No, I'm asking you to be more precise. What do you suggest?
I suggest that we look at system principles that was already brought up. I think that we need to have a firm look at, differentiate between people who are making $50K a year and $100K a year. Need to understand that in many cases, children need adults around who are supportive. Why maybe we could consider putting ECEs in kindergartens only. We need to look at, I want to hear about ideas that are little different from the norm, because those people going up to celebrate, that we celebrated the other night, are doing innovative things in our schools, and those folks may be going down the road kicking their lunch pail for too long. That's not right. That's not why I got here. I'll try and answer any specifics if you can give me a little more.
You mentioned one specific, system principles.
Yes, and system teachers. I'm people who are in administration. I see it as quality control is what happens in schools. I see it as quality assurance. It's what we do. Old boards used to just make sure that the best teachers and the best principals and the schools were heated and things happened there. That's what I'm talking about. That was one example.
Okay, I take your point.
Okay.
Trustee Danaher.
This is difficult, this to you, I guess to you, Chair, this question would be to you. I think this is a very difficult process to go through when you're cutting $11.7 million out of a budget. My concern is that we have 3 or 4 different proposals in front of us in terms of amounts that we're going to cut. I believe we have to, as a group of trustees of the board, make a decision on what our goal is in these cuts. Is our goal in these cuts for this year to balance the budget? Is our goal in these cuts this year to balance the budget and try and put some away? And before we can go any farther and look at the real cuts, I think we need to make that fundamental decision. A comment from me, I believe that because of the difficult year and the busing scenario and all the other things we've gone through, that we should be approaching this as a balanced budget cost cutting and not look at anything any deeper for this year, and maybe develop a plan for over the next 4 or 5 years to build our reserves back up again. But I think we have to make a fundamental decision as a group of trustees that yes, our goal is to cut 11.7, because we've seen different slides. There's 11.7, and Rogers had them up there, one all the way to 15 million. So is our goal, and I want to establish the goal, my motion or my question is, my recommendation is it a balanced budget for this year to look at 11.7 million, and then maybe look at a longer term plan in another year or two to develop, to bring our reserves back up into place and those kinds of things. But we need to make that decision, because I don't like this bouncing around all over the place, 11.7 up to 15 million.
Trustee McPherson?
Secondary to his comment, I agree we need to balance the budget. The question is, will we have any flexibility within this budget to meet emerging needs? In other words, we make this grand prediction in June, what we're going to have in September, and quite often things change. So in the past, we've always had enough flexibility to meet emerging needs. Are we going to have that flexibility, or are we going to end up with a flatline budget?
Trustee McDonald?
I wasn't going to answer that question, but I was just next to speak. So if there's anybody else wants to add to that, then.
Could you reiterate what you mean by a flatline budget? You mean what Trustee Danaher was saying, 11.7?
In other words, you talked about scenarios from everywhere from 11.7 to 15. Do we feel as a Board of Trustees that we need some flexibility to meet emergent needs? And we've always, over the past, have had it. I am getting the message here that we have nothing in the bank for meeting emerging needs. So we need to build that into this budget. Do we go for 12.7 instead of 11.7? And I think that's something we have to decide.
Fundamental questions. Trustee Bushra?
After Trustee McDonald, of course.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak. So, and I'll add some thoughts to that in the Trustee Danaher's comments. I think it's important that we have no choice. We have to pass a balanced budget based on the circumstances that we are in. So whatever the number is, if it's 11.7 or 10.2 or 13.5, we've got to figure out how we're going to get there. Hopefully it's lower. That would be nice. But given the levity of this, we've seen us try and add to our surplus in the past when we're dealing with some changes, midstream, some funding changes associated to it. But we're talking about $10 million or more typically right now. I think for us to sit and say that we want to add to our surplus, we need to, but to do that with this budget would not be good timing. I think for us is that we do what we need to do to get a balanced budget, and there won't be any leeway. The only leeway would be that hopefully every student that we predicted to come to us comes to us, because if they don't, then we're in desperate measure. But we put a financial plan together, much similar to what we've done in the past, that given a certain time frame, over a 5-year period or more, we begin to establish what those surpluses should be. And our target in the past was up to 3%, and we get back to that level. But that's not going to get done today. That's not going to get done this year. I can't see us, and coming from me, who always advocated to making sure that we had money available, given the circumstances that we're in this year, I don't think we can get to that point. We need to plan for it. We need to move forward. But it's not going to happen this year, in my view. When it comes back to some of the other comments that were said here tonight, I really understand and I appreciate the feedback, but when we talk about one school being more important than another school, whether it's rural or city, I take objection to that, because kids in city schools deserve just as many guidance counselors as they do in a rural school. And oftentimes, the city schools are the ones who get less because we have to supplement some of the rural schools. And I don't say that to cause a war. I say that we be careful on how we speak about our students, because they're all our students, regardless of where they live, regardless of the size of the school, regardless on the level of education that they have or are pursuing. When we talk about making sure that we have individuals within buildings, I certainly understand that and I appreciate that. But we are funded to a certain level. And if we're not funded for a full-time principal in a building, where do you suggest we pay for that from? Where do you think we would take that from? Because that extra funding needs to come from something. Is it going to come from the classroom to make sure that we've got an administrator in the building? Is it going to come from somewhere else? And I think we need to be cautious about putting lines in the sand saying we need to have these specific things in place when we don't know the ramifications from where they might come. The budget's prepared for us based on a staff C level of impact. Trustee McRae's talked about making sure that we have the least implications or the least measures impacting students, and I support that. I think we need to, that's the framework that we need to be around, is that when we look at our budget, we need to do everything to support students in the classroom. And some of those might have to be outside of the classroom as well, because there are some system requirements to make sure that we provide the guidance to those system classes, or to those classes, to make sure that they're doing certain things. So is this a perfect budget? Absolutely not. I'd rather be in a different circumstance and not have to deal with this. The reality is it's here. And the reality is that a lot of it, a majority of it, is as a result of some changes. And I'm not putting blame anywhere, but we knew some of these things were going to happen. There are some funding changes that have taken place that cause us to make these adjustments. We knew that certain funding was only going to last a certain period of time, so we need to make sure that those adjustments are made. Things have happened that we have to deal with class size. Those are realities, and those things need to take place. If they didn't, then it'd be a different conversation in this budget. But I think it's a good one for us to be creative in the sense of how are we still going to support students without impacting them? And if we have the ability to make these adjustments and find $10 or $11 million and still achieve our outcome, our desired outcome of providing a successful life for our students or leading them to that successful life, then I think we've done a good job. I think over the course of the next few years, it'd be important for us to make sure that we find any other efficiencies that we can maximize where they don't impact students, but we take advantage of those, and that's how we start to build our surplus back, and that's how we start to put more resources back into our classrooms. And so, I'm not suggesting that we certainly carte blanche look at this and pass it, but I think we need to put a little bit more thought into it and make sure and understand that the impacts that we have are impacting students in the most minimal way.
Thank you. As your chair, one of the things that one of my duties is to try and coagulate opinion as I hear it. So the first, I'm going to call it principle number 1, and that's principle as in PLE. Are we in agreement with regard to the 11.7 in offsetting considerations, period? Can we establish that first?
You're strictly talking of the amount.
I'm talking about the amount, 11.7.
No above that.
No. I'm asking you, that's my principle, that I'm suggesting that if we can adopt that, then that we, on a go-forward basis, we might have a basis for discussion.
I think you need that in the form of a motion.
Through you, Chair?
Yes, we do eventually, but let's discuss it. Do you want it as a motion now? I mean, it's emerging, so if you want it, make the motion.
I think.
May I ask a question? Trustee Swan?
Yes, Trustee Swan.
My understanding is we have to pass a balanced budget, so I thought that was 11.7, I thought it was 11.8, was the number, the magic number that we have to pass to be compliant. And now am I misunderstood here?
That is the number.
So why is it debatable? Because we can't pass a non-compliant budget, can we?
Because Trustee McPherson made some allusion to the fact that maybe we needed to build in contingency.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. McCray?
I'll say I agree that this 11.698021 is no contingencies.
How, trustees, do you want the motion to read? Could you give me some direction on this one? I mean, we just can't we're not, at this moment, we're not passing a budget. Or we are approving cutbacks to the tune of 11.7?
Yeah.
Period. If someone wants to make that motion, then
I'll make that motion, because I don't want to build a contingency this year because we're cutting too much.
Is there a seconder? Trustee Barry. Discussion. Trustee McPherson.
I do not think you should put a specific number on it. I think you simply should state you're going to pass a balanced budget, because you could have something show up when we start crunching the final numbers that will perhaps exceed the number you have put in that motion. So make it generic, say the Board of Trustees will pass a balanced budget.
I'm fine to alter it to that, and that is better, and I agree.
Yeah.
Trustee Krem?
I was going to make an amendment to do that so that we go back to what Trustee Danaher was saying. We've set a parameter of what our budget's going to be. We can argue as to which ones in the budget are the ones we want to do, as long as we don't go over the balanced budget figure.
We can slice it and cut it any way we want. It's still 11.7.
I agree. And that's why.
Whether it's a budgeted or balanced budget or 11.7, they're both balanced budgets. So, any further discussion on that motion? Could we have the motion, please? We don't have the motion.
So, just a point of clarification. We really legally can't pass anything other than a balanced budget. So the motion is a moot point at this, I mean, unless we want to be non-compliant.
There's that possibility.
Well, but I guess what I'm saying is, rather than saying we want to pass a balanced budget, we have to, because we have other ramifications. I think what we want to be able to say is that the motion would be more, in a positive sense, is reestablishing our surplus based on a financial plan to be presented by administration. So it's not included in this budget, but it's something that would be presented later on. Therefore, we still have legal obligation to pass a balanced budget, but staff can prepare a financial plan for us on how we would deal with that moving forward. It achieves what we're looking for, so that we're not building it into this year, but we're also trying to deal with it in the future.
Maybe I'm missing, I know it's a given that we have to pass a balanced budget, but it's a statement of principle that the motion provides. Any further discussion? Yes?
We heard a few months back about the board from Hastings that were, if I remember, non-compliant. And so they were brought to the attention of the province, and they had to do some, to bring it back to our discussions, they had to look at a lot of cuts, a lot of different way of doing things. And I think that we may have to, that's what most,
Mr. McRae, I'm sorry, but I don't think that those comments are germane to the motion.
Let me try and explain how I think they are. I think that when we're talking about a budget that's non-compliant, and I would think that is where there are some decisions to make on the product that we're putting out there that may put us in a position that would be non-compliant if we so choose to do that.
That's what the motion, I'm sorry, the motion is that we will be compliant, that we will have a balanced budget. That is the basic principle. That's what we're saying. Do not complicate things.
Well, but it is also the truth that that is the case.
We can find those innovations that you want in here maybe. Right now, I'm asking for the principle.
Yeah, all right.
Any further discussion? All in favor? Do we need a recorded vote?
I think we should make the motion, like read the motion.
Okay, do you have the motion yet? The motion is that the Upper Canada District School Board is committed to passing a balanced budget.
Yeah.
Period.
Simple, John? Simple, excuse me? Very simple, straightforward, and says it all.
Okay, I'm going to take the vote now, please. Do we want a recorded vote for these?
Yes.
Yes, we do.
And you may need to refresh your screens to see if they don't want to vote.
And by that you mean doing what?
Just to either refresh
Circle
your
thing
screen
right
and
there,
do a
the
little
refresh
circle
button.
thing.
Where's the refresh button? This one?
Right there,
Just
that's
to
it.
reload your screen to make sure.
Do you see the little circle refresh button with an arrow on the end of it?
It's here somewhere.
The mover was
I'll go smiley face.
trustee Danaher, seconder trustee Kramer.
Yeah, but what if we're not?
Where's the refresh?
Pardon?
This works.
Oh, I got it.
You have it?
Pop up for you?
I just hit that little button right there.
Pop up on your screen?
Do I have to go to this chart? Yes.
Go back into your board, There you go.
I have the vote. Who does not have it on their screen?
I don't have it.
I don't have it yet.
You have to.
There it is, I got it.
I refreshed it.
Thank you.
Just go through that refreshing process.
Have to go back to the main.
Yeah, you're on the right track there.
Hey, you have to go back.
There.
All right.
Okay. So you
That motion passes. Next. I want to perhaps go back to trustee Schooler's point with regard to a full-time principal and/or VP in school. If we do that, the 11.7 has to increase.
Cut it somewhere else.
Pardon?
Find money somewhere else.
We have to find some money somewhere else.
Without going over the 11.6 number.
Now, I guess, so I'm determining, that was trustee Schooler's thought. Is there an appetite to support that?
Through you, Chair?
Yes, trustee Swan?
I am through twinning of schools, or in favor, as long as there is a full-time office administrator in each school. So I'm for that proposal. I've done it in I had it in my 2 schools here, and it worked fairly well. And plus, my understanding is we aren't funded for that position. So in small schools. So if this helps any rural schools stay open and we can show the fundings there for the positions that are there, then I'm all for this. Thank you.
Okay, we're now jumping though from office administrator to, or from principal, vice principal to office administrator. Let's deal with one first. Trustee Schooler?
Just through your chair, point of clarification, is the envelope for system principals separate from the envelope for school principals? And is the money transferable between the two?
Sure. Through you, Mr. Chair. I'll look at my compatriot at the other end of the table, but yes, there is an envelope for day school, and that's calculated by the number of students that are in the school as well as the proximity to other schools. So that by that I mean a small school, but that's very rural, that's geographically isolated, would still be allocated a 1.0 principal, whereas those smaller schools that are within proximity of other schools would not be. They're actually funded to the 0.4, depending upon the size. Now, system principals are also funded through sweatered envelopes. So an example of that would be Safe Schools. We have a Safe Schools principal is funded through Safe Schools allocation, student success through student success allocation, and so on and so forth. School effectiveness through programs, special education as well.
Follow-up question through you, Chair.
Yes.
So are we currently then allowing small schools to have full-time administrators at extra cost to the board?
Yeah, that would be correct, yes, through you, Mr. Chair.
Trustee McPherson?
If we, now, I'll admit, most of these small schools are in my backyard. If we go over to a system of part-time principal in some of the smaller schools, can we do something operational that would make them more effective? Instead of them heading off to meetings 2-3 times a month, can we not connect by technology? That a lot of these out-of-school events that can actually occur within the principal's office. I know it's not as much, it's harder to get something from a meeting when you're not face-to-face. I will admit that. But perhaps through the use of the existing technology we have, we can make better use of their time, especially if they're only there for 50% of the time as an administrator.
Okay, you're adding innovative practices now.
That sounds really good.
True.
Right.
But I'm dealing with principals and vice principals.
Okay.
I'm just trying to get a handle on this one. Yes, Trustee McRae.
The study suggests that principals operate about 60 hours a week. One would think that they should be, any of those that should be in school as much as possible. So I think that idea of them not going elsewhere for meetings is good.
Innovative practice.
That's principle number 4, innovative practices. I'm talking about principals and vice principals in a school. What is the wish of the body here? Trustee McDonald?
I'm, based on the recommendation, we see twinning of 2 schools, or 4 schools total, 2. two in particular. I think that we've done it in the past. We've also had situations where we've had less than full-time principals, and when the finances were good, we were able to increase it to full-time principals. I think at this point we do it and have a full report when it comes to next budget year on the implications of having twinning of schools and having less than a full-time principal in some of our schools based on the recommendations that are before us. And that would help us determine what we do moving forward. But right now, the impact is only going to be in 4 schools.
Is that a motion?
Well, no. My concern is that if we start to motion this down, we are essentially passing the budget in various ways. I think, you know, the work that you're doing is good to guide us and to make sure that it provides some feedback to our administration. I think there's some things that still need to come forward to make sure that we hit the mark, and I really don't want to get into a situation where we're passing a motion by motion about particular lines within what's been presented to us.
Good point.
Through you, Chair?
Yes, Trustee Swan?
I'm not sure if I'm the only trustee that might feel this way, and I see the level 1, level 2, level 3 in the budget scenario, possibly, but what would be really beneficial to me is to see what actually is funding or discretionary that it can be moved. So what is funded, what isn't, and what positions are we getting the funding for that have to go in that area? And what funding are we getting that doesn't? I mean, we've been told verbally sometimes, but I'd like to see that in writing.
Can anyone provide direction? What are we funded for and what are we not funded for?
Mr. Chair, that is very complex and very, there's a combination. There would be certain areas that there's specific funding allocated in specific cases. It's other where it's more general, and then the board is spending as it see fits throughout the, to try to handle that on a global basis would be extremely difficult.
A secondary?
Yes, Trustee Swan?
So could we just have brackets, general or specific?
Mr. Chair, we could make an attempt at that, yes.
We will make an attempt.
Yep.
The decision, though, that I think that I'm trying to come to some sort of a consensus around is whether we remain with the reduction in school administrators, option 1, part 1, or option 1, part 2, or option 2, which is Trustee Schooler's proposal. Trustee Cram.
With the 4 schools that are being that we're looking at twinning, how many of them currently have less than a full-time office administrator?
All 4, right? All 4 would have. Yeah, Mr. Chair, I'm pretty sure in the case of the 4 schools, the smaller schools, all 4 would be less than an administrator
currently.
Office currently, and the plan would be to put a full-time in there.
Because I know that was my question was leading to option B, because that was a concern I had before, that the office administrators were less than a full-time. You're taking a full-time principal out and you're putting a half-time vice principal in. So with option 2, I think personally I would go with 2B, which is I firmly believe every school should have a full-time principal. I believe that. However, where we are, at least the office administrator in 2B has been restored to a full-time office administrator, which will relieve some of that pressure that will be in a school with a half-time vice principal. Still would like to go farther, but we're in the situation where I don't think we can help it. So if we go to option 2, or option 1, part 2, whatever one it is, then 2B is the one that I personally would be okay with at this point. I think it was slide 13, if I'm not mistaken, on the...
Is there a consensus for that position, reduction in school administrators, twinning of schools, 2B? Could we clarify exactly what that means?
Yes, Mr. Chair, in the 2B that Trustee Krem was referring to, it would be in the 4 larger schools, full-time principal. In the smaller school, a half-time vice principal with a full 1.0 office administrator in the school.
Trustee Schooler?
Point of clarification, are we saying 2B or not 2B? That is the question.
Okay.
Good question.
Yeah, I just wanted to know.
I would say, is there a consensus around 2B? Hands up. Do I have a vote? Not a vote, but a straw poll.
Straw.
Or not to be.
I think 2B is. 2B lives. All right? So 2B, principal number 2.
That's just 4 schools.
Right. Next.
We've only got 100 more to go, John.
Can I ask you a question, please?
Yes, Trustee Barry?
I'd like to have further clarification on about 6 or 7 down there. It says further reduction in program department. Part 2, $703,917. And then further reduction in program department. Part 3, $454,000 and change. That's over $1 million. And I don't know what ramifications it would have at the classroom door. Could I have a clarification on that, please?
Certainly through Mr. Chair. Actually, I'll look to my, I'm going to look to our superintendent business colleague first.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Trustees will recall that had to do with the system resource of the Learning Commons Informationist and doing a reorganization in there to reduce the cost. And obviously, with the larger savings, there are a greater, obviously, reduction or reorganization of that area. And in terms of the actual impact on the system, then I would turn it over to Superintendent Loshaw to comment on that.
Superintendent Loshaw, would you care to chime in?
Certainly, through you, Mr. Chair. We're looking at the what is before you as a budget consideration for the reduction of Learning Commons Informationist, and specifically a level 1 impact of an LCI reduction would be a small impact or reduction in the number of 2.5, and it's a level 1 impact because there are operational efficiencies or operational contingencies rather to support the work that would be redistributed among other LCIs. When we look at level 3A and 3B, it's a significant reduction of the number of LCIs, and that's where we get into the limited number of operational contingencies to support the work that would be in play because of the reduction in LCIs. And of course, with the further reduction, then we would say that there are no viable operational contingencies.
If we went to 3A.
If we went to 3B, we would say that there were no viable operational contingencies.
Has to be more viable than 3A, which is 300,000 more. Am I missing something here?
That's an addition, right?
That's an addition. Oh, I see.
Further.
Yeah, further reduction.
All right. So here's another question for us. 3A or 3B?
No, I don't think so. I think it's both in there. It's not an either or. Sorry, Mr. Chair, for speaking like that.
Please enlighten me.
Yes, Mr. Chair, when it shows the further reduction and it is in the envelope under the possible budget scenario, it's cumulative. It's...
Okay.
My understanding, John, Mr. Trustee McAllister, is if you take out Part 3, and then you're going to find another $454,000.
Correct.
Somewhere else
correct.
to stay at $11,698.
Right. Trustee Barry.
Several of us have had a chance. This is a painful process, and we're all unhappy. You can just feel it in the room. Although I do want to say that there's a certain amount of competency and thought, and I can see that there's an effort to make it as inconsequential at the classroom door as possible. There's a number of things that are particularly painful in here. Reduction of system teachers, $1,020,000. I know what that means from experience. And that's going to impact. And the other one is the reduction of the school, well, one of the other ones is a reduction of the school office support staff. Now, I don't know whether there's too much to ask, but I'd like to see, like, okay, we have 72 schools.
79.
Pardon me?
79.
79, thank you. Okay. How much work will it be? Is it possible? 79 schools. This is how much, like North Dundas has 2.5 or something. Under this, with this 1 million taken out, how much office time does North Dundas have? How much office time does Seaway have? How much time does Morrisburg Public School have? I'm referring to all schools in my area, but I'd just like to know how much hurt it's going to be if it isn't too much work. I'd just like to assess the amount of hurt that line means. And what I really want to say is I asked the question at the beginning of this exercise, does the local MPP know that we're really sitting down tonight to cut 11.7 million, and really of that 11.7 million, the way I calculate things, only 11.5 is due to a reduction in funding. Now, okay, we can go through the exercise this year, but if next year we have to go through another 11.5 million, in addition to the amount of reduction we have with the declining enrollment, it's really going to hurt, and the following year. And where my efforts are going to be is trying to get this government's mind changed to not making this reduction. Mr. Clark has made his statements in the paper. We have chosen not to be combative, but we are here and we are cutting people's lives, and it is not fun. And I'm done. I'm off the soapbox. Thank you for letting me vent, sir.
And I'd just like to
excuse
add...
me, Trustee Swan. Trustee McDonald, you're first. You're on the line.
Thank you. I just wanted to point out, and I certainly understand we want to know the impact, but if we go back to a presentation, and I can't remember the date, but it was in May, I believe, we received a presentation from Mr. Bouchard and the finance team that showed us the areas that were overspent. So we identified spec ed, transportation, that's taken care of. Supply teachers was one. We're overspent on supply teachers by $1.4 million. School office staff, not including TR Leger, by $1.2 million. And then we had put a pilot project in place for rural guidance teachers. We overspent it. We got money for rural guidance, and then we overspent it. So two big contributors, other than spec ed, are the number of supply teachers that we have. So it speaks to sometimes the delivery of our training model, potentially. And school office staff, 1.2 million. So if we're only getting a certain amount on school office staff, we got to figure it out somehow. Like, there are lots of ideal situations, but I don't go out and buy a Ferrari because I'd like to have one. I don't buy it because I can't afford it. So we can't do everything that we want to do based on the money that we get, unless we go out and get more kids, then we get more money. It's not going to happen that way, that quickly. So we need to start to live within our means of the funding that we get in the certain envelopes. And if we want to overspend in certain areas, then we need to make sure that we have those conversations at the table, rather than indicating that it's just, we're going to start to look at level ones and level twos. We've decided over the past couple of years to spend additional funds on special education. And I think if we look at some of the expenses around special education, we've included funding that we get through the regular spec ed funding, but our expenses have also included some additional things. There's probably another 1.3 million that should be from the local priorities grant that would go into the funding. So 1 point some million. So the 8 million or so that we overspend in spec ed may not be that high. But we need to start to take a look at those types of things. If we don't address the cost drivers, the things that we're overspending on, we'll continue to overspend on them and not know where we're going to be finding the money elsewhere if we start to make those cuts. And I think that's the thing that we need to focus on, trustees. If we just make cuts blindly, we're not really putting any solutions in place to deal with those things that are overspent. And that's my concern, is that we've got a good idea of where our overspending is. The preparation that we have in front of us starts to address some of that. And I think that we need to be able to move forward and take advantage of some of those recommendations.
Trustee McDonald, I see two thoughts here, two trains of thought. One is restricting our spending to what our revenue is in certain areas, as well as compensating for having done so by looking at some innovative practices. Is that a basic principle that you can live with, trustees? My eloquence baffles you, or what?
No, I've got a question wherever you get to.
We haven't finished this discussion.
Yeah.
Trustee McPherson, is it on this topic?
It is, in that it's a new program, and it refers to special education. We are doing a pilot project on, I believe it's the Power School model. However, we've got 3 scenarios in front of us. The cost of the pilot project is roughly $640,000 to set it up. Is that above or below the number that we see, like 816,000 and change? Is there deeper cuts there that are funding the pilot project, or will the pilot project be funded out of that 816,000?
Superintendent Ferguson?
Through you, Mr. Chair. It's accounted for. The spending for the pilot program is accounted for, so it's already taken out of. So if you didn't do it, then it would go up higher by the $602,000.
Okay.
So it would be.
So that's your net amount after the pilot project. Okay.
Correct.
I just needed that clarification. And that is hoping to access more funding through the special incidents grant, right?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we anticipate that over the long run, it will do 2 things: reduce costs and increase potentially increase revenue.
Okay.
Trustee Cram?
Just further to that, Chair, if we do get more funding through the SIP program, what is our intention to do with that extra money?
Could you repeat that, please, Trustee Cram?
If we're passing our budget now, or not now, or this year, on a balanced budget, assuming we get more money from SIP, because we're reevaluating on the power program, and it brings in more money. That's more money than we've got revenue now.
Mm-hmm.
What is our intent to do with that extra money? Is that what we're going to do, build up the reserve? Is that going to be for somewhere else? Where have we targeted that money for?
Mr. Chair, I'll pass this along to my colleague.
Mr. Chair, it's a very good question. The trustees explained it very well. There's nothing in here now. We don't know if we're going to get it. It's a new program for the board to make application. We don't know if they'll change the criteria or what. There's really two components in answering. One is longer term. When you come to next year's budget, you'll have a much better idea of whether it worked and the grant system worked, and then you can start to build it into the budget, and the trustees will make a decision at that point whether you put in more spec ed services or whether you do something else. In year, if you were to find out something, then the board would have a decision to make whether potentially adding more special education services in year if senior staff bring back and say there's a need somewhere, or you're right, it could be a contingency of sorts for that year built in that you don't know right now. So it's up to the trustees at that point.
Does that answer your question? Trustee Swan, I'm sorry I forgot you.
Well, no, I was just going to comment on Trustee Barry's comment, because am I not correct that our declining enrollment is only projected to be down by 14 students next year? So this is not what our funding problem is.
Mr. Chair, in response, the trustee is right. It's 14 at the elementary level, but it's 194 at the secondary level, projected for next year, a reduction. So the trustee is correct that it's not 1,000 students you're losing, which would be obviously a very great impact, but it's not zero. 200 is significant, but not like some of the reductions you've seen in the past. It is starting to stabilize.
So secondary, so we're losing approximately 200 students projected, yet
correct.
Our budget is 11.8 million less.
The shortfall in our budget is 11.7 million.
Yeah. Mr. Chair, if Trustee Swan is alluding to the fact that all of the fiscal problem is not related to the reduction in enrollment, she's absolutely correct. The main components are the reduction in significant components of really the special grants the board were getting. Perfect example is the local priorities funding that Trustee McDonald aptly pointed out was a short-term 2-year program. As we know, that was $3.6 million that is now being eliminated. And so it was other components of the funding model that are contributing mainly to the 11.7 million shortfall.
Thanks for the clarification.
Trustee McRae?
I'd like to go back to Trustee McDonald's. If I heard you, you're suggesting that to have a more detailed look at the budget. How do you do that without looking at a line by line? How do trustees look at it except to look at it where all the expenses are from one end to the other?
My answer to that question, Trustee McRae, is that it is not really our role to look at a line by line. We can look at a line by line as a total of, say, departments, which is really what we're doing now. But it does not behoove us to do a line by line. There are too many lines and not enough brains in this cell here anyway.
Well, I don't know, but from an accounting perspective, how else?
Well,
and I'm asking David because he has some expertise.
Trustee David? Trustee McDonald?
Well, I tread lightly on the expertise part, but
all right.
When I talk about more detail, I don't necessarily want to go line by line because we pass a point where it becomes effective, right? Like we're not. Okay. If we start looking at $2,000, we're really spinning our wheels. But what I want to focus on was what are those cost drivers? So if we're funded for supply teachers at a level of 3.7, but we're spending $5 million, right? That's a cost driver that we can start to pay attention to, and whether it be through innovative practices about delivering PD, or whether there's another issue that we need to focus on. But it's $1.4 million that we're spending having occasional teachers come into our schools, and is it because of training? Is it because of absenteeism? Whatever the case might be, we need to get it under control.
And would you not look at the ledger headings then, at least to see where in a particular whether supply teachers or whatever, but you look at where that monies are in that particular ledger heading. Is there?
Yeah,
I think if I could, with regard to, say, supply teachers,
Yeah.
if we determine that our level is the revenue, that, in other words, that would be our baseline, the revenue which we receive, then that's the line we look at. We don't look at the details
Well, that's
within
the other
that.
half of it. That's how a profit and loss statement gets made in private sector, is you look at the revenue, and then you look at the expenses, and you see where the
That is
expenses
exactly
are.
what he has suggested. Trustee McPherson?
Picking up on the supply teacher situation, what happens if you say we're going to spend to the line and the need exceeds the supply? What do you do then? You get 3/4 of the way through the school year, you spend 100% of your allocation, and gosh, you've got 10, 12 teachers have booked off for flu bug or something like that. What do? Put a non-teacher in front of the classroom?
It's still a cost.
Like, there has to be a reason that we have exceeded that. Has the need historically exceeded the funding that we're getting? And that applies to a great many lines. Special education was exceeded by $8.7 million last year to meet what we felt were justifiable needs of our students. So if you're going to hold the line, you also better have a contingency plan in place, there's that dirty word again, to deal with your shortfall if it happens.
Trustees, we've identified a number of areas. Do you want to look at the possible budget scenario? And I can go down, we can go through the lines, and simply, without much comment, because we've commented quite a bit, do you want the same, more, or less? And then we'll leave it with our staff to figure it out. I don't mean to dump on you, but is that a plausible scenario?
I have one more question.
Trustee McPherson.
Okay, looking at our budget considerations and looking at all the information that we've gotten financially from the ministry, line 2 speaks to the grade 4 to 8 classroom teacher allocation, a reduction by $1.2 million plus change. Where in this chart do I see the class grades, the secondary teacher allocation? We know that we lost money there. We did have some payback, but there's still an anticipated shortfall that we hope to meet through attrition. But where does the secondary show up on this chart?
I think I can answer that question.
Fine.
It's one question I can answer.
Okay, I'll go with that.
We will be staffing according to our collective agreements, which is the 21-to-1.
Okay.
And that's the answer.
Okay.
Next year, that's another question. Good question next year, I would say.
Okay.
Am I right, Mr. Richard?
That is correct, Mr. Chair. We must staff in accordance with the collective agreement at this point, 22-to-1. And Mr. Chair is totally correct in that we don't know what next year will bring. Obviously, that'll be part of the negotiation process over the next year.
Can we go through the green possible budget scenario line and simply say, I mean, some of them are like the grade 4 to 8 classroom allocation. That's pretty fixed. Not much we can do about that, right?
Question.
Yes.
My only question before we get to that point was around the reallocation of the 1.9 for rural northern education. So is that the 1.944, is that the level of funding that we're going to be getting in 2019-20?
Yeah. Mr. Chair, the actual funding is 1.4 or just above 1.4. The rest of that amount was the over expenditure that the board had in place for last year. So by reducing that amount, it directly contributes to the bottom line of saving 1.9 million.
Follow up. So for receiving what was it, 1.4 or whatever? Yeah.
Correct.
If we're receiving 1.4 to support rural and northern education, the pilot project dealt with guidance, we're still getting 1.4 that's going to go to rural and northern education program. So it's really not a savings. Like, if we're getting the funding because we can't allocate it, or how are we going to allocate it differently? I'm not sure I understand that savings associated to it. If we're going to save anything, it's just the difference between what we're overspent and what we're getting funded on, which is the difference between the 1.4 and the 1.9. Because we're going to keep our spending in line.
Mr. Chair, I believe the intent is that it would go to the bottom line, the total amount, because it'll be reallocated when we report to areas we're already spending, and we'll use already spending areas to justify the 1.4 million.
So, Mr. Chair? So if we're only getting funding of 1.4, we should only have a level of 1.4 then, because we overspent last year. So I'm hoping we learned our mistake. We wouldn't have overspent it again. We wouldn't take $500,000 and put it to the bottom line if we don't need to, right?
Mr. Chair, the trustee is absolutely correct, and in fact, that's what we're doing. If we would move to next year, we would only show a 1.4 million. The trustee's correct, but because we're coming out of the year, you'll remember when we started the process, senior staff starts with, you have the same budget as you had last year. So it assumes that we did nothing. And so what we're saying is that, of course, there won't be that over expenditure, so you immediately save 500 and something thousand because you're not going to have that over expenditure. We're recommending you take it out of the budget, and so it happens automatically.
But our baseline shouldn't be what we spent last year if we overspent it. Our baseline should be what we get funded for. And then we make the determination, right?
Correct, Mr. Chair, but we don't make that assumption that we just take it out. We bring it to the board to show that you had overspent and that was part of the budget when you did it. And so we don't come back and say you just saved 1.4 and by the way, we took out 600,000 you had spent last year. We show it all to you, and that's effectively what we're doing, is taking it out. The trustee's correct. We're taking out that over expenditure into this year, but we're showing it to you up front.
Okay. Mr. Richard, I'm going to ask you to take us through line by line on the green and indicate which areas, that, like we have no discussion point. For example, grade 4 to 8 classroom allocation, there's no discussion, is there?
Sure. Mr. Chair, that's certainly what the trustees' input has been over the last month in terms of that we're simply reallocating efficiently to meet the same needs for the students, but doing it efficiently in terms of both the first and second one. Mr. Chair, you're correct, the early childhood educators in the grade 4 to 8 classroom. The secondary program, I believe the Vice Chair indicated a question about secondary. Well, those would be secondary in that case that would be reduced. You'll recall that was the additional student success funding for teachers that we used it for. And so once again, that would simply go back to the collective agreement and what we've agreed that we would staff. The central administration staffing is one position and 2 offices within the central office. The rural northern education, Mr. Chair, I believe we've spoken about. And then the system teachers, it's simply a question of trying to find funding at various, and I think one trustee pointed out very aptly that obviously we're trying to minimize the impact directly on the classroom. Reduction in system principals, we've spoken about. The further reduction in central admin is the elimination of a superintendent position.
I'm going to stop you right now, for now, please.
Sure.
Trustees, do you understand those first 7 or 8? Everybody clear? Okay, continue, Mr. Richard, please.
Mr. Chair, the next item is the reorganization of the TR Leger, which involves a restructuring and a consolidation of a couple sites. And so certainly I think, as Superintendent Rudders pointed out to the board in past presentations, certainly going to continue to meet the needs of the students with respect to the resources available, very manageable, and does save us just under $1 million. And I believe I've already spoken to the next 3, which involves a reorganization of the Learning Commons area And the next one is a small reduction in the area of English language learner instructors, Mr.
That's the
Chair.
454,000?
No, the 454 is part of a combination of the two above. That was the Learning Commons area. It was the 74,000, Mr. Chair, that was the English language learner instructors. You want me to stop there?
Through you, Chair, a question there.
Yes.
I'm just wondering how much the impact of reduction in the Learning Commons area will have if we have to implement, or we're supposed to implement, these 4 online courses in the high schools. Has that been looked at?
Mr. Coombs?
Through you, Mr. Chair, at this point, that will not be taking in effect next year. Certainly, that we're still waiting to hear more from the ministry of how they intend to roll out that requirement, and we expect to hear more regarding that. But at this point, those LCIs would not be working directly with those students in schools. Certainly, that would be something that we'll have to work out as we find out more from the ministry of how they intend to manage that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Richard?
I'll continue then, Mr. Chair. The reduction of the school office support staff, I believe the board has had a fulsome discussion on. It is simply realigning the expenses related to the board office support staff to school office support staff in line with the actual revenue that we receive for that line. And then in terms of the twinning of schools, you'll see there that the only one of the 2 options put forth was the, I guess we'll call it the 2B option, which is the 280,000, which I think we've explained, which is a full principal in the larger schools, a half-time vice principal in the smaller, with a full-time 1.0 FTE office administrator in the 4 smaller schools. And then under the school operations allocation, simply realigning the cost to match the loss in revenue on that line. And that, Mr. Chair, would result in, before special education, of about 2.8 million. And then looking at the level 1, which the vice chair of the board aptly pointed out, after we take into account the power program, then the resulting savings would be 816,000 plus, for a total of just under $11.7 million.
Thank you, Mr. Richard. Trustees, I think we, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we have the basis for a budget based on some of the things that we discussed, which was principle number 1, the balanced budget. Principle number 2, which was the principal VP, and we opted for 2B. Principle number 3, office administrators, we opted for principle 2B. Am I correct?
In that scenario, yes.
In that scenario. And principle number 4 I'm using is innovative practices in areas where we have overspent, and one example is the area of supply teachers. And I just use that as an example. Trustee Cram?
This question, Chair, on a reduction of school office support staff.
Yes.
Do all of our, do any of our schools get funding at less than 1.0? I know we have schools with less than 1.0 in them, but are all schools funded at 1.0 when we, and how many are funded at 8.86?
Mr. Chair, not all schools would be funded, not unlike the vice principals in the admin category. When the school is really small, it would not contribute enough to be the full 1.0.
Okay. Trustees, do you have any further questions? Trustee McCray?
I'd like to explore a little, perhaps with Jeremy, on the school operations allocation reductions to $610,440. Perhaps get a little more details on that.
Who would we direct that to? Superintendent Hobbs?
Superintendent Hobbs, yes.
Could you perhaps explain that line, Superintendent Hobbs?
Sure. So, typically, owing to the nature of facilities, we tend to look at budgets out on the order of 5 years out into the future and try to actually start adapting before we have to. So, over the course of the last number of years, 10 years or so, we've been really aggressively applying capital budgets towards achieving energy efficiencies, for example. So, a significant portion of the $610,000 that we're looking at in reductions, we feel will be able to be achieved through savings in utilities costs that are a result of just putting in more energy efficient sort of building systems as part of our sort of last 10 years or so of campaign in that direction. Another significant portion of it will be that a number of surplus properties have come off the books over the course of the last year as a result of disposition. So these are schools that have been closed and are in various stages of sale. So those will be actually coming off the books. And those will be expenses that for heating, maintenance, grass cutting, those kinds of things that will be coming off the books as well. And then we actually have what we call our 4300 account, which really is a fund that we use for general maintenance for schools. So it's not what you would consider to be capital projects. That would be betterments. They would be things that would be things like routine replacements of flooring, painting, and those kinds of things. And that as I recall, is around there's around $2 million in that particular budget, and so the remainder of that $610,000 that's not accounted for by utility savings would come out of that 4300 account. And the way we actually mitigate that change is by what we tend to do now is I think we're sitting on the order of, you factor in all our construction projects that we have on the books, as well as our capital renewal and school condition improvement capital funds that we have, close to around $100 million in capital funding. And so what we're doing is, rather than trying to pay for regular maintenance out of the maintenance budget, we're trying to bundle those maintenance projects in with larger capital projects, and therefore be able to use that capital funding. So what you see happening for us is a shift away from doing standalone painting projects towards that would be funded out of operations, to using bundling it in with a larger capital project, which could be a bigger refurbishment at a school. We do the painting in that kind of setting, and therefore we can capitalize that budget. So we really don't see it as being a material impact to our ability to offer service to schools in the coming year.
Just to clarify, I think I'm hearing that there are no capital projects being canceled.
That's correct.
Yes, thank you.
Mr. Clark made that very clear in our meeting last week. I want to, ladies and gentlemen, I think...
please?
Pardon?
I just had a quick question.
Yes, Trustee Swan?
The reduction in system principal assignments, $282,450. Are we fully funded then if we make that reduction for the other system principals?
Mr. Chair, the two that we're showing there as a reduction, they are not covered by specific funding which is enveloped or anything, and so the savings would go directly to the bottom line and there's no impact with respect to enveloping or losing funding or anything. It's simply 100% savings to the bottom line for the board.
So a secondary, if we cut more, would it be a further savings to the board?
Mr. Chair, not necessarily. It actually depends which specific one that you would want to reduce. There are several system principles which have specific funding within the technical paper, and if the board decided they didn't want to put one in, it would simply get expensed to the bottom line, put into a deferred revenue account, and you'd have to spend even more the next year. So it does not have any savings on the bottom line. So we're obviously indicating ones that aren't covered by specific.
Thank you.
Trustees, if there are no further questions, I think we have the basis for a budget, along with those four principles that I've been trying to keep track of. And I think we will be in a position to, hopefully staff will be in a position to present us with almost a finished budget on June the 12th. Is that satisfactory, trustees?
Mr. Chair, I would just want to clarify, as the trustees are well aware, your normal cycle for board meetings is 2 weeks, and you know that you have implemented a weekly schedule. The only difference that we would have to point out from the Finance Department is we can be ready for next Wednesday, but it would not be that detailed one that you normally get at the end of your budget process. For next week, it would show the high-level revenues and expenses by the broader categories, but definitely at this point for Wednesday, we would not be able to deliver the
Could
full.
we call it a draft for Wednesday on the 12th with a final copy on the 19th?
We certainly make every effort to have that ready. That is a good compromise.
Okay, trustees, thank you very much for a very fulsome dialogue, conversation. And we've accomplished a lot, I think. So we are now moving back into, where are we? We are 1301? 1301, right? Which is the report from private session. At its committee of the whole meeting in private session, number 1, May 29th, 2019, one contractual matter was discussed. At its committee of the whole meeting in private session, number 2, May 29, 2019, one personnel matter was discussed, and no recommendations were brought forward to the board. You have information items 14.4, 01, 02, 03, 04, and we are now going to item 15, private session, and I suggest that as soon as we get into private session, we maybe take a break for 10 minutes, Chair, or trustees, do you mind? Good point? All right.
Mr. Chair, I'm just commenting, would it be, I think my colleagues could call it a night as far as...
Yes, indeed. We thank them very much for being
I'm
here.
happy to hang around, but I'm thinking that they can...
Right, absolutely. Yes. Is there a motion? Oh, moving to private session, yes. I need a motion from Trustee McPherson and Trustee Cram that the Upper Canada District School Board move into Committee of the Whole 2019 at 9:33. Please cast your vote. All in favor?
All in favor.
Carried.